Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project. And I want to thank those who are joining us for episode 23 on Filibuster. Before we begin, I'd like to proceed with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Turaja Tone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. And as noted, today's focus is on the filibuster. Most of you, I think, will already know something about what the filibuster is, but for anyone who doesn't, I want to just offer the brief definition. That the filibuster is the practice of delaying a vote in a legislature by long speech making. So using basically unlimited or lengthy debate or speech making to prevent a vote from taking place on legislation. I want to begin our conversation with a brief history of the filibuster in the US legislature. The very first session of the US Senate took place in 1789, and senators from Virginia used the strategy of essentially, quote, talking away the time, unquote, in the parlance of senators observing the phenomenon at the time, to prevent passage of a bill. This practice at the time wasn't known as the filibuster. The term filibuster emerged in the 19th century. And it has two different origins. One is from a Dutch word that means freebooter. A freebooter is a person who loots or raids. And similarly, it's also derived from the Spanish term filibusteros, which referred to pirates at the time who were raiding in the Caribbean islands. So the idea of filibuster is a person who filibusters as someone who is raiding, looting, stealing, taking. The association between making long speeches to prevent a political vote and piracy, being a pirate, likely derives from the ways in which filibustering was seen as a way to steal or take power, or at least to semi-illicitly hijack the political process. By the mid-1850s, the term filibustering had become the commonly used term to describe the practice of preventing a vote through lengthy speech making in the US Congress, particularly the US Senate. It wasn't until the early 20th century, with encouragement from then President Woodrow Wilson, that Senate members created the procedure of cloture, spelled C-L-O-T-U-R-E, a way to close debate and proceed directly to a vote, thereby ending a filibuster. Initially, when Congress, or when the Senate first passed a rule about this, cloture required a 2/3 majority, which at the time would have meant, or at this time would have meant, 67 out of 100 senators. But it was lowered in 1970 by the US Senate to a 3/5 majority, or 60 out of 100 senators. We mostly hear about the filibuster in the Senate rather than the House of Representatives for good reason. Historically, the filibuster was used in the US House of Representatives as well, but the practice was ended in the House with procedures to limit debate earlier in the 19th century, so in the early 1800s, essentially. Filibustering in the House was used by a range of 19th century representatives or congresspeople, and it's most notoriously associated with a US representative and attorney named Barrett Gardiner, who served in the early 19th century. There's some historical evidence, so it's not confirmed, that he might have once filibustered for 24 hours. His practices were widely acknowledged and referenced by John Adams in a letter to his grandson, who wrote, quote, "You lawyers can talk forever," and referenced Gardiner as an example, describing him as a, quote, "very clever fellow." In 1808, Gardiner's verbiage became the basis for a violent conflict in which he wound up challenging US Representative George Campbell to an armed duel. Gardiner was actually shot, but he recovered and returned to the House of Representatives undeterred and continued filibustering just as often and for just as long. Eventually, however, he frustrated enough of his fellow representatives that they basically reworked their rules in order to prevent him from engaging in unlimited debates and speeches. In 1811, Representative Thomas Golson successfully called for a vote, interrupting Gardiner's filibuster and getting the bill in question, which dealt with a trade embargo against Britain, to an immediate vote. Golson won that vote to end the filibuster at 66-13. And this move effectively created a procedural practice, which was then understood as part of the House rules to end debate. And this has persisted in the House of Representatives since 1811. So this is the reason we almost only hear about the filibuster in the US Senate today. For those who attended or listened to our 20th episode last month on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you already know that in the US Senate, the filibuster was used in the last century by white Southern senators to try to prevent the passage of civil rights legislation in order to maintain white supremacist Jim Crow laws. There have been instances when liberal or progressive senators have made use of the filibuster or just the threat of the filibuster. In 2013, 2015, 2017, conservative congresspersons have repeatedly introduced a bill entitled the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, with the intention of effectively overturning Roe versus Wade. Many of you know that the Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade established limited but still significant 14th Amendment constitutional protection for access to abortion and for privacy as a reproductive right. In 2 of the 3 instances, meaning between 2013, 15, and 17, the act enjoyed a Senate majority, so it was poised to pass, but it was unable to proceed to a vote because it did not have the 60 votes needed to achieve cloture. And therefore, essentially, the threat of a filibuster kept it from passing and significantly restricting abortion access nationwide. The Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, by the way, has been reintroduced in the Senate this year by Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. Given the current composition of the Senate, it's very unlikely to pass during this current session of Congress, which will last through December of 2022. Historically, the filibuster has sometimes been used in service of causes such as defending free speech in wartime or challenging legislation that ostensibly favors the rich. Others have seen it as a way to gain public attention and then educate the public about a particular political issue. In the current Senate landscape, progressive and even slightly progressive senators are united in the stance that the filibuster does much more harm than good by obstructing democratic process and providing a tool that can be used to combat racial justice-oriented legislation. Those following contemporary news may have noted that currently 2 Democratic senators who are considered relatively conservative by Democratic Party standards, namely Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, have been most resistant to a move to permanently end the filibuster in the Senate. Of these 2, Joe Manchin is considered most resistant, with a 50-50 split between Republicans on one side and Democrats and independents on the other side, and Vice President Kamala Harris is the Senate tiebreaker. There's essentially no means to end the filibuster unless the Democratic senators unite with no exceptions, or unless at least one Republican senator breaks ranks and votes with the Democrats to end the filibuster. Opponents of the filibuster, however, indicate that it can be ended if there is enough public advocacy and pressure. And for instance, civil rights and faith leaders have mobilized through what they term a moral march to visit Senator Joe Manchin in order to advance their arguments against the filibuster and to attempt to call upon his conscience or at least his susceptibility to public opinion. Just to lay out the arguments a little more clearly, advocates for the filibuster argue that it promotes bipartisan cooperation, meaning it forces the parties to work together, and it prevents the majority party in any given period from exercising too much power. Opponents of the filibuster respond that it's unhealthy for representative democracy as it essentially prevents the will of the majority of voters from manifesting more fully in the Senate and keeps the Senate from getting more work done. Some of the most compelling arguments against the filibuster continue to focus on its legacies of use to facilitate racial injustice. Historical examples of this include Senator Strom Thurmond's 24-hour speech to stall passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and that's 24 straight hours. Early 20th century filibustering to block any legislation challenging white supremacy eventually resulted in the 1922 US legislature being publicly termed the Do-Nothing Congress, as the filibuster was used to block anti-lynching legislation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, commented in publication that anti-lynching legislation, quote, was not killed by a majority vote, but was lynched by a filibuster, close quote. So one of the reasons that some of our civil rights landmarks, such as Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation in public schools, emerged in the federal courts rather than in Congress, was because civil rights entities such as the NAACP recognized that the Senate procedures, and particularly the filibuster, were functioning as an effective blockade against any civil rights legislation. So in contemplating the question of whether the filibuster should be ended, a powerful question to ask about our current Senate and any future incarnations is this: if the filibuster continues, should we expect that it would continue to be used to block efforts to achieve racial equity? For those who would like to read more on the history and present incarnation of the filibuster, a book option is Gregory Koger's text, Filibustering, A Political History of Obstruction in the House and Senate. And for those in our Zoom audience, I will put that book title directly into the chat for you. And again, the author is Gregory Koger. The last name is spelled K-O-G-E-R. Now, those who are familiar with the Civics Project know that for many of our sessions, we do civics trivia, where we have 3 multiple choice questions related to our subject of the day. So for those in our Zoom audience, I'm going to share screen. This is also a good moment, Zoom attendees, if you have questions, to add them into the chat so that we can answer them in this episode. So we'll begin our civics trivia now, and for those listening to podcast, you'll be able to follow along as I'll read each of the questions out. So first, who engaged in the longest filibuster in the historical record of the US Senate? Answer choice A is Alphonse D'Amato of New York. B is Senator Strom Thurmond. C is Barrett Gardiner. And D is Ted Cruz. And the correct answer on this one is B, Strom Thurmond, whose record 1957 filibuster took 24 hours and 18 minutes. The record had previously been held by Alphonse D'Amato, who had filibustered for over 23 hours. Barrett Gardiner, as we mentioned, may have filibustered for as long as 24 hours, but he was in the House of Representatives, not the US Senate, and the time of his filibuster is not confirmed. And Senator Ted Cruz is way up there. I believe he makes the top 5. He has filibustered for as long as 22 hours, but not broken the record set by Strom Thurmond. And again, Strom Thurmond's 24 plus hour filibuster was to block the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. What is quorum busting? Quorum, Q-U-O-R-U-M, R-U-M, for those of us listening, for those of you listening by podcast. So answer choice A, quorum busting is preventing senators from being present to vote. Answer choice B is a walkout or deliberate absence to prevent a vote. C is arresting senators who fail to appear for a vote. And D is preventing the count of senators to establish a quorum is present in order to enable a vote. Now, before I I share the right answer to this question, I want to stress that, or rather, I want to share for anybody who isn't familiar with the term quorum, that a quorum is the minimum number, in this case, of senators, or minimum number of people who must be present in a legislative body or other policymaking entity in order for a vote to be called. So in instances where a filibuster has failed and cloture has been called, or a filibuster is not an option, Congress people historically and recently have used quorum busting as another tool, a related and integrated tool to block a vote. So the correct answer, as you might expect, given what I've just shared, is that quorum busting is a walkout or a deliberate agreement on the part of some senators in the US Congress to be absent so that a vote cannot be called. So flying to another state, for instance, is something that contemporary senators have done in order to prevent a quorum, deliberately keeping a full session of Congress from being present so that a vote cannot occur. So this is kind of a companion tactic to the filibuster. For those who are curious, it now is possible. In recent decades, it's become an option for senators who are deliberately quorum busting, who are failing to appear for a vote to be called to appear by the Sergeant of Arms, and if, and this is the new part, they don't, to actually be arrested for obstructing the Senate process and compelled to appear. So quorum busting is walking out or not showing up to keep a vote from happening. Last question, has the filibuster ever been used to block a Supreme Court appointment? Answer choice A is yes, more than half a dozen times in the 20th century alone. B is no, never. C is no, but the threat of it has been used to block a nomination. And D is yes, once in 1968 over the nomination of Abe Fortas. And D is the correct answer here. A Supreme Court appointment was blocked by the filibuster. Associate Justice Abe Fortas, already a federal court judge, was nominated for the Supreme Court, and it was very late in the congressional session, and it was somewhat similar to the circumstances we recently had in which Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away and the Senate rushed to confirm Amy Coney Barrett before power could change hands between parties. So we had a similar situation in 1968. Lyndon B. Johnson nominated Abe Fortas, and the party opposition basically filibustered during his confirmation hearings until his nomination was withdrawn. So he would have made it to the Supreme Court otherwise, and the filibuster was used to block his appointment. And it raises the question, we'd have to see what members of the Democratic Party would say. You know, technically they could have done the same thing, for instance, to block the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. And I haven't heard anyone comment on what inhibited them, whether it was a sort of moral or ethical concern or some other political imperative from taking action to block her appointment. So for those of you in our Zoom session, I'm going to share some learning links for more information about the trivia we've just shared. Those will show up in the chat. And I also today want to share a book recommendation for those who'd like to learn more about the subject. Oh, I already did. I'm sorry, folks. Gregory Koger's text, Filibustering: Political History of Obstruction in the House and the Senate. I want to invite folks back next week for our upcoming episode on Social Security on August 8th. The Repair Student Intern team will be back to lead the Civics Project on August 15th on the subject of public schools. We'll be back on August 22nd to talk about the subject of domestic terrorism as a term in US policy and particularly security policy. And on the 29th to talk about the colonization of Puerto Rico as a US territory. And we'll be joined on the 29th with Nicole Hernandez of Puerto Ricans in Action. So I hope lots of you will come out to hear her in August. And we have already confirmed our first session in September. On September 5th, we'll be joined by Dominique Nong and Edgar Ibarra Dominique is with the Children's Defense Fund, and Edgar is a survivor of youth incarceration and a really wonderful activist, and will be coming to join us to talk about youth incarceration on September 5th. As always, you can find live registration links for upcoming events on our Eventbrite registration page. For those of you who joined us in Zoom, you'll see the link to find more events in your registration confirmation. We'll also send a follow-up. For those of you listening on podcast, the live registration link is in the podcast episode description. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. And we will reconvene next week. And for those of you with us in Zoom, hang out for a few minutes if you would like to ask questions. Thanks, everyone.